Thanks for coming today. My name's Alex Kocha. I'm a junior Africana Studies and Peace Studies major at the university. I'm also the current student body president. Student government has had a really strong recent history working on sustainability issues on campus, and so I'm looking forward to continuing those efforts in the upcoming year. I'm also honored to present and introduce our next speaker, Andrew Rosenberg. Andrew Rosenberg is director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He has more than 25 years of experience in government service and academic and nonprofit leadership. He is the author of scores of peer-reviewed studies and reports on fisheries and ocean management, and has published on the intersection between science and policymaking. Prior to his time at UCS, Rosenberg worked at Conservation International, where he served for 2 years as the organization's senior vice president for science and knowledge, and served as the Northeast Regional Administrator of the National Marine Fisheries Service at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where he negotiated recovery plans for New England and Mid-Atlantic fishery resources, endangered species protections, and habitat conservation programs. He later became deputy director of that service. Dr. Rosenberg is also the convening lead author of the Oceans chapter of the U.S. Climate Impacts Advisory Panel. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Ocean Studies Board and the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy. He is a professor of natural resources and the environment at the University of New Hampshire, where he previously served as dean of the College of Life Sciences and Agriculture. We're honored to have him. Please help me welcome Andrew Rosenberg.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers and all of you for the invitation. You might wonder why somebody who's worked in fisheries and ocean science is here to talk about climate or science in the age of scrutiny as my title, and that's because I've spent much of my career working on that interface between science and public policy. And of course, in recent years, that's much of the debate and much of the contention has focused around climate issues. And that's what I'll talk about today. First, I would like to tell you what the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists is. It is a new program that I was hired to be the inaugural director last summer. And our focus is on advancing to the role of science in democratic processes and public policy decisions. In other words, we're interested in making real, a famous phrase from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, everyone is entitled to their opinion, but not their own set of facts. And so we are trying to address the issue of science in public policy by identifying the barriers that bring science into the public policy debate and overcoming those barriers, building an active, motivated constituency for the scientific information that should pertain to public policy decisions, build a demand in the public and amongst policymakers for science, and believe that'll lead to better public policy solutions. And of course, climate is an important public policy issue from many fronts, whether you're talking about mitigation, adaptation, or social justice, or many of the other issues that arise. I have been particularly interested and engaged in this conference, despite injuries, which I'll mention in a moment, because it's a bit different from most of the climate conferences that I participate in, including the National Climate Assessment, which was mentioned in the introduction, and Nancy Grimm gave you an overview of the National Climate Assessment. The reason it's different is primarily because of yesterday's sessions on morality, spirituality, the theology that relates to climate issues. And I think that's an incredibly important perspective because leading this Center for Science and Democracy, it's clear to us, and was from the outset, that science is not the driver of public policy. Science is an input to public policy. We want people to pay attention to the evidence, but realize that the business of societal choice, those things that make up public policy, hopefully will be based on the science, but is not solely determined by the science. And so the idea that this community and the many excellent speakers yesterday, even though I had a hard time following much of your scholarship, being a fisheries biologist after all, means that you're addressing a very large part of the public policy and problem-solving conundrum, and that is how people make their choices about what society should do and how they will act within that society. So I have been really enjoyed this conference. The other reason I've really enjoyed it is I go to many science meetings, and sometimes I sit in sessions and think, gee, I heard many of these talks before. In fact, I think I've given many of these talks before. And I can't say that about anything that was said yesterday. And so I did very much enjoy it. So I now want to turn to, of course, the subject of the conference, and that is global climate change. But I want to start with a, if you like, personal metaphor. There are some basic science principles, if you like, principles of physics and chemistry and biology that are important. And they're important to me because in the physics, chemistry, and biology of a battle between your finger and a car door, it's fairly likely that it's your finger that will be injured, not the car door. And the parallel to that is if you put a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it's fairly straightforward from a scientific perspective that you will increase the warming of the globe in an uneven pattern, but certainly increase the warming of the globe. And that's really a straightforward consequence of scientific principles that have been known for a very long time. As Ram said on Monday, as a scientist, I'm interested in experimentation and observation as well. I'm not an experimentalist, but I certainly have worked with survey data and statistics for a long time. I'm also interested in the idea of looking at indicators or proxies for underlying processes. And so we really want to base our understanding of the natural world on experiment, observation, and sometimes indicators. Well, I can tell you that I learned in my classes that there are a lot of nerve endings in your hands, and I experimented with that on Sunday night and found out that that is a true statement. There are an awful lot of nerve endings in your fingers. I think if anyone was nearby when I slammed the car door on my finger, they would have heard what we might refer to as indicators or proxies in some of the language I used, which is not in the best tradition of Catholic teaching, I'm sure. But certainly was a good proxy for how it felt. And in the climate record, of course, we have real observations, not simply the scientific principles about global warming. We have observations of changes in the instrumented period of time, in other words, the relatively recent past. We also have proxies for the climate that can extend that record back thousands of years, and I'll show you one of those graphs in a little while. Because it's been so controversial. But we clearly have the same kind of, as in my metaphor, we use both observation and proxy. And then finally, I was thinking about deference to expertise and to established knowledge, because my initial reaction to slamming the car door in my hand is that really hurts, but yeah, it'll probably be all right. I therefore got on an airplane, which was really popular with the other passengers as I was bleeding copiously. But then I decided to go to the emergency room when I got to South Bend, and a few times in the inevitable wait in the emergency room, I thought, well, maybe I'll just go back to the hotel. It'll probably all be okay, until I saw the doctor who said, boy, you made a real mess. It's not going to be okay, and proceeded to sew my finger back together. Now, that's also true in climate. You'll have a lot of people who will say, well, we have all these observations, but it'll really be okay without any deference to the expertise. But in fact, the expert opinion and established knowledge is there's not really any reason to suppose that it'll all be okay when you have, as shown on the screen, a set of processes that are well known and well observed that are changing the climate and warming the world. So that's my personal metaphor. I won't torture you with it anymore. I've already tortured myself enough with it. So just to move on very quickly to some of the results from the National Climate Assessment, Nancy Grimm talked about the assessment itself and that it is across a large number of scientists involved in many different areas. I'm mostly going to talk about what are, at least at this point, the best information we have about the impacts on the Midwest. We know that we've observed temperature change in the U.S., and it's rather extraordinary but extremely uneven. We know why it's uneven, but as Andy Revkin pointed out, predicting that unevenness is actually quite difficult because of variability in the data. So we know that, in fact, we've had this observed warming, and in my, oops, that was the wrong way. And in my own world, in ocean science, we know that there's been significant warming in the oceans, which are a major heat sink for the globe, of course. And that is by direct observation. Some people, as I'll show you in a moment, have cherry-picked the data in some ways to try to pretend that that's not actually the case, but a straightforward look at the observational data as well as historical proxies show that we have had that warming. We also know that the potential impacts on things such as infrastructure are large. I'm obviously not going to read all of these things. You can pick your favorite column or row on the likelihood of occurrence and the magnitude of the consequences. In some cases, you may have something that is medium to low likelihood of occurrence, but extremely high consequence, such as flooding of tunnels, that you need to pay attention to. This goes to Andy's point about how people perceive risk. It's difficult to get the general public to focus on this idea that there are specific risks, say, to infrastructure, but that's why you actually have public policymakers and elected officials in order to take that broader view. Now, the Midwest chapter I was not a member of. You can see the authors here, but I would note in the National Climate Assessment, again, I was one of the lead authors for the Oceans chapter, and I'm on the Executive Secretariat for the assessment. But there were regional chapters, there are sectoral chapters all around the country that are concise statements of what we expect to happen, and there also is a very voluminous set of analyses which are effectively regional scenarios, given what the projections are of changing climate, what will happen in each of the regions of the country. And if you would like more information, all of those are available on the U.S. Global Change Research Program website, and you can look through them as much as you like. So here are just some of the immediate results coming out of that Midwest assessment chapter. Temperatures are increasing. We certainly know that's true. It's a rate of warming that's accelerating, and we are projecting that that rate of warming in degrees Fahrenheit is quite large. Now, again, in terms of public perception, many people would say, well, a 4 or 5 degrees warming, I wouldn't really mind that as you're sitting in South Bend in January. But, of course, remember, these are regional averages, and it's hard for people to really understand the impact of averages by and large. There's an interesting parallel in Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, which I haven't verified, but I believe from talking to Jared is correct, that a 5-degree centigrade now warming or cooling doesn't seem like very much, but the last ice age was 5 degrees on average, global average, cooler than today. And it caused a pretty big environmental change for whatever you know about the ice age. So these are actually pretty large changes in the averages. There certainly are changing precipitation patterns, becoming more extreme, decreases in snowfall, overall precipitation in this region changing, increasing, but in other regions decreasing dramatically. There are potential changes, both positive and negative, in agricultural yield, again, extremely important throughout the Midwest region. It's a little unclear how those will balance out. More CO2 has an important positive effect, but hotter and drier summers have a negative effect, even though there may be more precipitation. Its timing or phenology may be off, and so on. Forest composition changes are anticipated in the region and have been well documented, the beginning of those changes. So these are not all projections, these are observation and then future projection. Urban environments at risk with extreme heat events. precipitation events, and the like. There was some discussion of that earlier in the week by Professor Fernando about heat islands and the like, but it's particularly the extremes or the variability that matters. And if I can digress for a moment, I really liked the cartoon that Andy showed of the Danish cartoon of a man walking a dog, partly because I like dogs a lot, but actually because I thought it was illustrative. There's a couple of things that you should note about that with regard to the parallel to climate and weather. Under climate change, the man would no longer be walking in a straight line, but would be, if you'd like an increase to the left, then would be curving to the left. And the dog's leash would get longer because the variability is higher. So all of a sudden the dog would have wider swings, and that's what you observe. That's the parallel to extreme weather. So if the man used a longer leash, he would have less control of the dogs, although of course my dogs never behave that way. So we should think about those extremes. It doesn't mean any one event is associated with climate change. It does mean that there's more extremes. And then, of course, higher energy requirements because of the need for cooling. There's certainly countervailing opportunities for biofuels and renewables as well. Ice cover declining on the Great Lakes, again, it already has declined. And it's expected that that will continue to change, although lake levels may not change appreciably, unlike sea level. The National Climate Assessment, opposed to the summary of those impacts, just think about what it is. It's a Federal Advisory Committee under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. It's constituted by people being appointed with a review of credentials and then signing conflict of interest statements, which are available to the public, as well as being signed on as special government employees, which doesn't confer you any compensation, but you actually have to be on the government rolls to be as a special government employee to serve on one of these panels. It's uncompensated. It's an enormous amount of work, trust me. There are hundreds of scientists that are involved in the National Climate Assessment, including scientists from academia, from industry, from NGOs. Very few NGOs, actually 2, on the 60-member advisory panel for the National Climate Assessment that I'm aware of. Most of the scientists are from academic or research institutions, independent research institutions. And it's mandated by Congress. Its assessment is required by the Global Change Research Act. And its mandate is to report to Congress and to the executive branch. So it literally is a synthesis from hundreds of scientists. There's no new research being done primarily. And it is in a public setting with public comment periods, as Nancy showed. Now, all of that's important because the main subject of this talk is about science in the age of scrutiny, or the pushback on this underlying science that should be, again, a guide to thinking about what societal choices we want to make. And those societal choices range from doing nothing to taking extreme action and everything in between, of course. The science is a guide to any of those possibilities in one way or another. That science coming out of something like the National Climate Assessment will indicate where we have strong evidence, where we have weaker evidence, and what the likely impacts are, hence the name. It's the National Climate Advisory Panel for Impacts, and its formal title is an impossible acronym. But it's really about what are the impacts on the U.S. That's the question that was posed to us. So given that as the background for what we think the likely impacts are in the Midwest and the setup for the National Climate Assessment, the Union of Concerned Scientists has had a campaign called Weight of the Evidence to amplify the voices of climate scientists about the underlying processes and what we know about human-caused global warming. And the reason I show this slide is not an advertisement for UCS, but it's because weight of the evidence is actually a really important concept in this regard. there is a tendency in a lot of current debate to turn this into an adversarial system, and I, in some ways, attribute that to people, at least in my generation, spending too much time watching Perry Mason, and current generation, perhaps Law and Order, where someone goes, aha! Isn't it true that you manufactured the evidence and really on that day you were in a different place and you killed the victim? But science doesn't really work that way. There is a lot of back and forth, but that adversarial, and there is an adversarial system of a sort, but it's not a courtroom. We're looking at the overall weight of evidence that would indicate a particular pattern. And so while the gotcha climate has pervaded, the Perry Mason style might have pervaded this debate, that's not at least the science process in its usual form for most other issues. But for some issues like climate and some others, some public health issues, we've turned to this form of adversarial debate. Now, there's no question, as we'll come to in a minute, that scientists disagree. In fact, I think it's usually the case if you have two scientists in the room, you have at least 5 opinions. But it's certainly the case that there is an overall weight of evidence. And it seems hard to keep that in the public mind, that this is not beyond a shadow of a doubt or any other legalistic, semi-legalistic phrase. It is about the weight of evidence about what we know, and I think the evidence is very compelling. That was interesting. So this gentleman, to step back in history a little bit, is Admiral Robert Fitzroy. Anybody happen to know who Robert Fitzroy was? The captain of the Beagle? And he, in his later life, became the head of the UK Met Office, which now is quite important in climate science. In fact, it has one of the principal models. He became very interested in weather forecasting. And his weather forecasting was not an almanac, but was based on a series of observations and the ability to use new technology of the telegraph to bring together observations from across the UK, from France, and the continent, and many other places. And in 1861, published in the Real Times, not the New York Times, the first ever, I just got Andy to look up, I was trying, the first ever weather forecast appearing in that
Real Times recently?
yeah, I have. In that publication, this was that weather forecast. And the reason I bring that up here is for forecasting the weather, he immediately got an enormous amount of pressure from all sides saying this is all wrong. People were very angry about inaccurate reports and were irritated about predicting bad weather at all because ship owners and fishermen might lose some money because the fishermen might refuse to leave the dock or the sailors might refuse to leave the dock in the face of an unfavorable report. And I thought, that sounds familiar, but 150 years ago. So I wouldn't say it's a new problem for people to deny what might be a strong set of evidence, but the megaphone is larger, if you like. Unfortunately, he met an untimely end. So denial is an important part of the issues of science in the age of scrutiny. And that scrutiny comes from a lot of directions. I have an advantage because UCS, Union of Concerned Scientists, publishes a cartoon calendar every year, so I get to use the cartoons for my talks. This was the cover. You really should get the calendar. But denial is one of the features of science in the age of scrutiny. It's scrutiny from all sides. It's public scrutiny, but it's also the fact that any individual can have a pretty loud voice, given the digital age, on pushing back on any particular fact that they dislike. And let me use a parallel from my own area of research. As was mentioned in my introduction, I was the fishery regulator, first in New England, where people are always nice and calm and relaxed about these things. I think Andy's reported on ocean issues before and probably knows that. I was the lead regulator for New England fisheries for some time and used to be escorted out of town by the police on a regular basis, which was a good thing. And there's a local newspaper in the town I live in, Gloucester, Massachusetts, called the Gloucester Times. And in recent years, the reporting in that Times has been virulently anti-government and particularly attacking the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and all of the fishery regulations, as it did when I was regional administrator. The only difference now is that it's online and picked up across the globe. So while it's a local newspaper, its impact is huge. And you will see the articles reprinted, even though, in my opinion, they're dramatically inaccurate and extremely biased. You'll see them reprinted literally across the globe. And I don't think that that was the case in nearly to that extent when I was the lead regulator. Some years ago, you may be familiar with what's often called ClimateGate. That is the theft of emails from the University of East Anglia Climate Center. Professor Fernando referred to this on Monday, and I'm going to disagree with him. Union of Concerned Scientists actually pushed back about the conclusions that people reached about those stolen emails. The reporting from the skeptics or deniers was, aha, this shows that the science is corrupted. So that led then to a series of at least 5 independent reviews I know of, including in UK Parliament, by the University of East Anglia itself, by the Inspector General's office within NOAA, on and on, all of which concluded actually there was no evidence of malfeasance or cherry picking of data or anything else, even though I think Professor Fernando referred to the fact that some data was selectively used. That turns out not to be the case. But it doesn't stop this endless machine of saying, okay, here we've uncovered the corruption in the science underlying climate change. So the fact that there's been those reviews, that it's basically been debunked, and that it was illegally taken in the first place, which is a separate issue and probably not really germane, hasn't taken it out of the blogosphere, if that's the appropriate phrase, or at least the digital world. And it continues to foment for a very long time afterwards. So it's not a short news cycle. In some ways, it's a steep news cycle with an endless tail. We did an analysis recently of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages and the Fox News channel and found that a very large majority of their reporting on climate science was misleading, inaccurate, or in some ways dismissive. Sometimes in anything that is labeled as misleading here, it could have been because they were attacking the scientists individually, sometimes quite nastily, in these opinion pages or news outlet, or the news outlet. Sometimes it was actually misrepresenting the science itself and stating things that were just incorrect based on the information that's either in the literature or in the data. Sometimes it was twisting the conclusion of what that meant in a way that was extremely misleading. We presented this then to News Corp, who said, yeah, thanks very much. We don't recycle, just toss it in the bin. It's also interesting, this is not just in the past. There was recently an article attacking the Australian Climate Commission, published in a News Corp publication in Australia, that included the suggestion that I think it's the chair of the Climate Commission should be brought before a judge wearing a black cap, which is traditionally the cap that's used by somebody deciding on capital punishment. And that was published as an opinion piece in a News Corp publication. So there's that continual drumbeat. To what end is unclear for a news outlet. Some of you may know who Ken Cuccinelli is. He's the Attorney General of Virginia, now running for governor. He subpoenaed emails for Michael Mann and then went into a long battle with the university over access to a scientist's emails. This was now not stolen emails like in East Anglia. This was using the power of an attorney general to try to access information, to which there was a long battle, which we worked with Professor Mann because it was considered basically just harassment. And the issue was not so much whether there was something in the emails that should be kept hidden, as much as should an attorney general have access to an academic's emails. And similarly, we've had other cases such as corporate interests like BP going after the email records of the scientists who actually helped them estimate how much oil was coming out of the money was probably an appropriate slip. How much money and oil was coming out of the Deepwater Horizon leak. They brought in some scientists from Woods Hole who revised the estimates dramatically upward, but then in the battle over what the reparations should be for the spill, BP attacked the scientists who had helped them with those estimates and said, well, you know, they manipulated the information, and we want to prove that by subpoenaing their emails as they were trying to figure out how do you estimate how much oil is spilling out at the bottom of the ocean. So it's become a part of common practice now to directly attack the scientists. Here's Mr. Cuccinelli, and this is actually a quote from a climate skeptic, in this case, Thomas Fuller, about his actions with regard to subpoenaing emails. This cartoon actually reminded me of Professor Ramanathan's presentation. He would be the one on the left here on Monday. We have to remember that, of course, anyone can challenge anything, and with a big megaphone. And this has become, of course, another part of the tactics of challenging individual scientists, whether it be through social media or simply utilizing the digital world as a way to cast doubt on a particular set of results that are inconvenient. Some of you may be familiar with the so-called hockey stick model, and hence my metaphor about using proxies to indicate climate change. So this is reconstructions originally from Mann for the last 1,500 years, and a more recent reconstruction over 10,000 years of what the temperature has been, to show that at the end of this there's a dramatic increase. And the relatively recent paper from Marcotte at Oregon State to extend that record back to show that the recent temperature pattern appears to be well outside the variability we've seen over 10,000 years. Well, why do I call this beating a dead horse with a hockey stick? Because immediately the same groups attacked the study, as they did with the hockey stick study, said that it was manipulated, that it was all wrong, etc. One of my favorite pieces of that is on one of the websites, this headline, which was much more dramatic the way they posted it, but I couldn't figure out how to cut and paste properly, that said there was a new climate scandal exposed, and that Marcotte admitted that the 20th century portion of the paleo temperature stack is not statistically robust, therefore the entire analysis is incorrect. The last phrase was included on the website and therefore is not the basis of the conclusions. Those are Marcotte's words. The actual full quote says, is therefore not the basis of the conclusions, and what we did is we compared the paleoclimate record to recent observations, and that's how you get the graph. So there was no attempt to use the recent period because of the statistical issues of trying to use recent data out of the paleo record. And so again, this is cherry-picking the information to say, aha, he said that there are some errors, and just drop the rest of the sentence. Now, unless you want to go back to the original source from a different website, you never get this part of the phrase. You never actually see this part of the phrase, and there's no reason why most people would go back to the original website. So these are become common tactics. We saw this one already, which is producing a new climate addendum to the climate impact assessment from the Cato Institute. If you're either entertained or irritated, then you might want to look at the Cato Institute's website on their justification why this is not deceptive in any sense. And there was no intention to be deceptive at any time. This was clearly an attempt to inform the public. So we have seen these kinds of direct attacks on scientists and their analysis. The attacks on Marcotte now are really quite bitter. Some of the scientists that we're working with have not only been attacked personally, they've been, received threats, all kinds of things from generating this enormous foment in the discussion. This is one of the most notable, which many of you may know. This was actually a real billboard, which was taken down subsequently. There's somebody who works with me now who believes in a libertarian philosophy and used to work in an organization affiliated with Heartland. When they did this, she left and said, well, I do believe in libertarianism, but that's not the way. But this kind of an attack or casting doubt on individual scientists have become the norm in the discussion. And so we've published a guide for scientists on how do you respond to those kinds of attacks. Science in the Age of Scrutiny, which is available on the website or in hard copy. There are some things that you can do. One of them actually is not to do what Marcotte did in the previous slide, which is try to respond in detail about the substance of the debate, because it just sort of seems to spin up into a longer effort to undermine every comment and continue down this long path. But it has now become a fact of life for many scientists working on issues in any way related to public policy, which in fact is very many scientists. There also, of course, is corporate influence on not only on the course of science, but also the interpretation of that science and how it is viewed in the public policy arena. On Proposition 23, which was an important milestone in California Global Warming Solutions Act, there was a very strong effort by fossil fuel industry to push back against attempts on public policy that actually was put into place to block basically the implementation of that clean energy progress. That's an ongoing effort. Same thing happened in the fight for clean energy in Michigan, which UCS was very involved in, trying to push a ballot initiative for renewable energy standards in Michigan, which ultimately failed with very large corporate influence, in this case particularly by the Koch brothers, successfully to manipulate public opinion. So while we might say, oh, a sign of the Unabomber or some of these claims about the science seem either transparent or foolish, we also have to recognize they're quite successful in many cases. We developed a report last year called The Climate of Corporate Control about the influence that corporations have had on the U.S. dialogue on climate science and policy. And we looked at a comparison about where companies in their public-facing materials expressed concern about climate change versus what they did with regard to behind the scenes on any policy actions. On the right-hand side here, opportunities to influence EPA policy or executive statements or annual reports to shareholders and the like. And in many cases, many of the corporations were not in sync. They would say they were concerned in a set of venues, but behind the scenes they were resisting any attempt to change policy. And this is again, this is nothing new, I would say, but it's become, because climate affects so many corporations, or they view it does, it's become a very broad-scale kind of attack on efforts to make real climate policy. And similarly, trade groups, which are, we've we're just in the midst of this report. We've done the first analyses and are working with the Carbon Disclosure Project on informing the investor community. But we have done an analysis of the position of trade groups, which are often the lobbying front, if you like, of many corporations or at least industry sectors, about how they treat the climate science, whether they have accepted that science, and whether they support policy actions to address climate issues. And in many cases, for many major organizations, most notably the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they clearly are both misrepresenting the science and not showing any policy support for real changes, and they have a very big megaphone. And finally, amongst elected officials, there is real concern, again, about how they are perceiving the science. We're in the middle of an analysis of the congressional record to look at where congressional committees obtain their scientific advice by looking at witness lists and whether that's changed. My at least null hypothesis would be that it hasn't changed, but I'm afraid we're going to find that we will find more and more partisan or agenda-driven groups testifying before science committees in Congress than we have in the past. But I don't know the answer because we haven't finished the analysis yet. We have some notable examples of elected officials attacking particular pieces of legislation, delaying action by the EPA, in this case from Senator Inhofe. We continue to deliver statements to elected officials that try to both clarify the record and clarify the positions that many scientists and eminent scientists hold on critical actions. But I can tell you that it can be pretty challenging testifying before a congressional committee. I have testified on climate issues as part of a couple of climate studies. I've also testified on ocean policy issues in many cases. I was reminded that when Andy was talking earlier, when he asked whether there was any economists in the room, and it turned out there weren't. I testified at a hearing some time ago on an ocean conservation issue, along with a panel that included me, someone from Mote Marine Lab, someone from the National Audubon Society who was a PhD ocean scientist, and an actress from Baywatch Hawaii who played a marine biologist on the show, who got the best response from the congressional committee. So I'd just like to say I'm not an economist, but I have played one on television. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. You actually have to wonder what you continue to appear before committees, and it's important to do that. But we'd also like to be able to make that separation that Andy referred to of what's the evidence and what do I think it means. Now, what do I think you ought to do about it as a citizen? And so in some sense, my program, Center for Science and Democracy, is trying to help scientists make those distinctions. Just before I do that, I'd also say that sometimes I think the Washington focus has hurt us. There's an enormous opportunity for scientists and citizens to engage at other than the Washington level in state legislatures, county councils, city councils, local governance boards, who also need scientific advice, if you like, or a basic understanding of the science. It is not, let's wait for Washington to do something or not do something. And it may be much harder for some of the negative forces that I've just run through, and I don't mean to depress you all, to push back against a citizen of South Bend, Indiana, who actually has some scientific knowledge, who is active in their community by helping bring that knowledge to members of the public. And again, I think we've seen echoes of that in a number of the talks in this conference. So finally, but one, if I can figure out how to click this with some other finger than my index finger. Well, I guess there isn't any sound, so that's a bit tough. Aha. Because Mr. Revkin unplugged it. Let me see if I can go back to the, oh.
The underlying reliance on science is a bulwark against the anti-science attacks that infuse our national debate now. If there's anything we've learned over the last few years, it's that science cannot afford to be silent.
So that was comments from Ed Markey, as you saw at a conference that we held last September on public access to governmental scientific information. But the words ring true in the climate debate. I don't think that scientists can afford to be silent in any sense of the word. And in fact, I would just close by saying that I think in this conference, the emphasis on the engagement from the Council of Bishops, engagement from a faith community broadly, is, if anything, emphasized by some of this attack on science, because the determining factor will be how people view their world. The determining factor will be how people believe they should act, on whether they believe they should act on under any faith basis, based on the scientific evidence or otherwise. But this debate will depend, and ultimately, if you like, the fate of the world will depend upon how people decide what their actions should be. And that's not a science issue. Social science has a lot to tell us about how people make decisions, but so does the faith community. So I would thank you and be happy to answer questions, and hope that was informative. And please don't anybody ask me how I could be so stupid as to put my hand in the car door, but that's a separate discussion. Wow, none. Okay, now you're scaring me a little bit.
My name is Alan Hamlet. One thing I wanted to add to your whack-a-mole list is that also other scientists will whack on you too, and they will use the media to play the Perry Mason game, you know, that I will whack on this scientist got it wrong, and I am the one who can straighten this out for you if you'll only give me this funding, etc. So I was curious what your thoughts on how prevalent you see that issue.
Actually, it's an important point, and I probably wasn't particularly articulate about it. The reason why I went through the hundreds of scientists and the public comment structure for something like the National Climate Assessment is that within that room, you're going to have lots of viewpoints. What matters is what's the, if you like, the weight of evidence that comes out from the group. Any individual scientist will disagree on lots of different issues. I'm sure, shocking as it might be to me, that people have actually disagreed with some of my papers. Now, of course, they were wrong, but it's inevitably the case that people will argue over issues as they do in any other field. I don't know anything about the Catholic Church, but I would guess occasionally there have been disagreements in the history of the Church. It's just a wild stab. And that's certainly true. But then there is a body of knowledge. There's a body of not only knowledge but experience and processed information that comes to some resolution as to a position at a particular point in time. And that's true in science as well.
For those who follow up, that really, and the scientists follow up, but I think the policy sector does not follow up, so which you alluded to already.
Well, some do.
Some
do. Because I was in a regulatory position, in other words, implementing policy, I think sometimes people are too dismissive of people in policy positions. For example, people will readily criticize the EPA, or in my world, National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA. Why didn't they do this and why didn't they do that? And my usual reaction was, well, okay, if you give me a free hand, I'll bet I can achieve many of the things that I happen to believe are right and I know how to do, but I don't have a free hand. I live in a democratic society, so I have to respond to Congress. I have to respond to elected officials. I used to say that my job was to get as much conservation as I could without somebody taking the authority away from me, and the somebody would be a federal judge, a political appointee, or a member of Congress. And the only reason I didn't want them to take the authority away from me is I thought I probably knew more about fisheries than they did. But that's the job of a implementer, of an EPA. And there are many in Congress who have spent a long time with these issues, sometimes, in my view, on the wrong side of them, but they're not, their attention span hasn't been short.
Can I just follow on that?
Please.
So, a follow on Alan's question, maybe you can repeat this so we can hear me. Scientists are nervous of getting whacked by those.
Can you ask in the microphone, please? Nobody
Sure,
can hear you.
I was going to.
I'll repeat it in a second.
Scientists are, I agree with Alan, another ballot is the scientific community. In fact, many scientists don't want to engage in that public sphere because they're afraid of being whacked by their colleagues. What
So-
would you say to fellow scientists about kind of linking that
So,
to
yeah.
Amy's talk about being innovative and experimental?
So the question was, many scientists don't want to engage because the scientific community itself can be a rather brutal place. They will be criticized for engaging. They will be criticized for the particular way that they, if you like, turn scientific results into common parlance. I'm sure you have, been in innumerable meetings where people would say, yes, but you left out all the detail, and the detail's important. I've studied it for the last 40 years. And, of course, the detail is important in some settings. There's no question of that. And there is intense criticism of scientists engaging. I remember being in a meeting once talking about public policy, and a guy that I knew quite well and respected as a scientist got up and said, well, first of all, I have to say the policy world is a dirty place, and I would never dirty my hands in that way. Now, this is what you ought to do. But there are many scientists who actually believe you should be completely disengaged, as I'm sure there are in other communities, including the faith community. And my response to that is twofold. First of all, that's a choice you can make. Not everyone wants to engage, and that's fine. Secondly, threefold. Secondly, for scientists who want to engage in public policy, you should actually learn something about it, because it's not because you are a scientist and you study whatever the field is, fisheries in my case, that all of a sudden you know a lot about the policy world. You actually have to do some work to learn about it. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I actually believe there's a generational shift in exactly that sentiment. My sense from my students and in the places that I talk to students, graduate and undergraduate, is that the current generation, or the last few generations of scientists, if you like, are fundamentally different from my generation of scientists training in the 70s and 80s, in the sense that we thought, well, either you go into academia or government and you just do your science. Now, almost every student I talk to, not every student, but almost every student I talk to is saying, so how do I have a bigger impact? I mean, I like doing my work, but how do I have more impact? How can I do these things? And the academic system is very slow to accommodate young early career scientists to allow them to do more in the public sphere, but there is a real hunger there to do it, and I think it's a generational shift. So my response is, well, that's nice, old man, but that's not the way the world is anymore. Sorry.
Hi, I was wondering if you could give some more specifics on what exactly engagement means, and both for scientists, and then there are lots of us in this room who are not scientists, but we support you, and we'd like to do more. And some of us just came back from the National Adaptation Forum, and I see echoes of these themes here too, which is you're supposed to follow every talk. We're being told this if we're going to help. A talk should be followed by action items, right? So, people get like revved up about a cause, and then they feel like they want to do something, and that for all of climate policy, that's been a struggle because there's a sense of a lack of efficacy among the general public, among policymakers, the whole what do I do? And so I was curious if you had any sort of pointers or bits of advice on concrete, something very specific that people could do in the scientific community and outside that community.
well, I certainly have opinions. Whether they're real pointers or not is, for you to judge. In terms of what engagement means, I think I'm using the term very generally in some ways and quite specifically in others. The general point is that there's more than just doing scientific research or science education. There is also trying to use the, if you like, the skills or capabilities that you've built as a scientist, for scientists, to help understand what's going on around you in the body politic. Not in the sense of political science, but why does science impact upon issues that affect people in their daily lives? And then trying to bring that into conversation within communities. I always used to ask, in teaching environmental policy, I'd ask the students, what was the environmental news today? And of course, in some sense, all news is environmental news. And they would come up with different issues of what you would consider traditional environmental issues that were reported in the news. Usually the most common news source was The Daily Show, but leaving that aside. But they weren't thinking that there were environmental implications of lots of other news, including news on North Korea, news about what's happening to the economy in China or within the US, and so on. And so the intent there was to think about how does scientific information play into my thinking about this issue, and to bring that into the community of people that you interact with, which is why I think the discussions about the initiative, the Bishop's initiative is important. You're reaching a much broader community than just talking to other scientists. I do also think that in terms of something to do, for non-scientists who actually want to hear at least that piece of evidence or that piece of information that comes from a broader science community in making societal choices, ask scientists, whether it's organizations like mine that have a science network of 20,000 people who have said, I want to be part of a UCS science network because I'm interested in these public policy issues, to be brought into discussions that you have within your own communities. So what is that underlying scientific evidence? Again, not because it's the determinant of action, but to try to help people be informed. And not informed that you want to turn everyone into a scientist. That's not the point. But there are important considerations that people need to know the outlines of as they make up their minds about issues, climate change to many other issues, including social issues.
I gather that you've, from your talked to a lot of different policymakers and committees and things like that. So I'm wondering, from your experience of doing that, are there certain messages or certain parts of the science that resonate more with policymakers and politicians and others? Like, is it the sea level rise, the warming of the planet? Is it health consequences? Is it arable land and crops? I mean, there are lots of different things we could focus on as we try to move policy forward here. And I'm wondering if certain things are more important than other things in terms of resonation.
Well, a gentleman from my state said all politics is local, and he was correct. The things that resonate the most are impacts on people that are within an elected official's purview, their district, their voters, their constituents. And while I do believe that I agree with Andy's statements about uncertainty, that we should be clear about what we don't know and not try to overstretch. Uncertainty is a very difficult concept to get across in a policy setting. I've actually had a congressman say to me in a hearing, if you say you're uncertain, that means you don't know what you're talking about. That was an interesting hearing. And so it's important to state what we do know quite well before you delve down into the details. So sometimes broad strokes and how they impact people can be more important than all of the underlying detail. And also, I think you have to be very careful to really be true to what you do know, what the weight of the evidence is, and not try to stretch beyond that. Because while science is in an age of scrutiny, politics is in an age of greater scrutiny. And you do not want to go beyond your data. You really don't, because you'll, as in many other fields, you will get caught. And so state what the information says and state what you believe it means. And that can be very impactful. But bring it home to a local example. And you see that every day in political statements. People bring it back to a local example. What does it mean to somebody in Chicago with a greater incidence of heat waves? What does it mean to an environmental justice community if they're higher risk from flooding or from sea level rise? All of those things are impacts on real people. And in fact, you don't need everyone to stand up and raise their right hand and say, I believe in anthropogenic climate change, to address some of those issues. And for my part, even if I want people to focus on both mitigation and adaptation of climate change, but if they'll do one, I'll take it.
Phil, introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Phil Sakimoto. I'm a lapsed UCS member.
I have a little pad in my
Yeah. I was a member back in the nuclear disaster days. But in the interim, I have been managing education and public outreach programs for the NASA Office of Space Science. I'm now here at Notre Dame. And I want to relate a little bit about that experience because I think it's very relevant here. First of all, I'm very impressed with what you're doing in terms of compiling information and providing advice for scientists in terms of how to talk about climate issues. We, over a decade, put together a program which we're getting scientists involved in education. And if I can quote from our independent evaluator, rather than my own perceptions, the evaluator said that during that decade, we actually caused a sea change from scientists wanting to have nothing to do with education, it's not my job, I do research, to being very excited about working in educational settings. And the evaluators told us that the real determining factor was that we had managed to put scientists in situations where they could see actual results from their work in education. And scientists being scientists, they'll do anything if they can see that what they're doing is actually effective and making a difference. And the way that happened was we provided scientists with partners from the education world so that they knew, so they could be led to where the leverage points were. And we would tell them, if you want to give a public talk, that's great, but we'll give you all the fancy view graphs. If you want to go to your daughter's third grade classroom, that's great, but wouldn't you rather come to the workshop where we're training teachers so you can affect hundreds of students instead of just those 25? Maybe it's a scientist that didn't want to do public speaking, as many don't. Fine. Would you like to sit down with a curriculum developer and simply be the science expert? And I'm thinking there must be a place here where what you're doing, similar things could happen, where especially the people around the room, thinking about yesterday. Wouldn't it be cool if a scientist could go with a theologian to a church setting? Let the theologian introduce why this is important to the church members, why we should pay attention. Let the scientists provide some of the facts and what to do, and build partnerships like that. So I think that if we can manage somehow to put scientists in settings where they can work with people who can put them in places where they can be effective, you can provide them with the things they can use as tools, then maybe we can start using that science talent effectively and making a bigger difference.
Yeah, first of all, I commend you for the kind of work in science education that you're talking about. It is exactly the right thing to do. But I'd also note that the U.S., let's say the U.S., not America, in this case, is somewhat unique in that because of the university, including public and private university system here, there literally are scientists in every community or within driving distance of every community in the country. And that's not necessarily true in other places. I mean, it's true in Denmark, but that's only because you can drive across Denmark in, a couple hours. But here, there are scientists everywhere. And so the question is, how do you engage more scientists in these kinds of activities? And I mentioned in passing the science network that is part of the Center for Science and Democracy, but is a Union of Concerned Scientists resource. And those are 20,000 scientists, which is a relatively small number compared to the number in the country, but still important, who have said that they want to be engaged. And so we run communications trainings and other things. And I've decided, as part of building this new center, that we need to do more than help teach people how to speak in public or work with the press or work with policymakers. Most scientists don't actually know how you would get yourself in front of a legislative committee or a church group, I mean, unless they happen to be in that church. And so how do we develop what I'll call engagement tools or opportunities for engagement where other organizations could come and say, we really would like somebody to come and talk to us about water issues or toxic contaminant issues in a particular locale, and we have the ability to connect them to people who have said, I'm interested in being engaged in public policy. Now that's a big challenge because all the people who put their hands up are not necessarily the people who are very good at doing that, and so you have to figure out how do you actually manage the process. But I do think that there is a much greater opportunity for engagement, and some of it is because we have that sort of deep reservoir of scientists and science tradition in the country that can bring in many, many, many more scientists to that set of activities. Now, of course, a lot of scientists are engaged in their church and their community in various ways, but usually in a narrow spectrum of interests. And science training, just like training in other fields, enables you to speak about more than just your own research. And so that's another challenge, is to overcome that reticence only to talk about the things that you study as an individual scientist, or you did your dissertation on, or you teach, your lab works on. Right.
One scientific group, Ron Nazer from DePaul University, one scientific group that I get fascinated by as a student of marketing are meteorologists. Mm-hmm. And it's always baffled me why they have been one of the real outliers. One of the explanations I heard coming from an advertising background, that advertisers put pressure on the news networks, especially in the South, when the meteorologist goes off the reservation. But they would seem to be, I don't understand the difference between weather and climate, but why is that group so absent?
So I think the issue of corporate influence is part of that. A second reason is that meteorologists, to some extent, felt that they were, the climate scientists were dismissive of them, felt that they were not included in the discussion. And so within the community, there's a little bit of, we're the ones who are looking at the weather every day. How come nobody's asking our engagement, just because you're a, geophysical fluid dynamicist doesn't necessarily mean that you're the repository of all knowledge. I think David might be a geophysical fluid dynamicist. Can't remember.
Yeah, Andy, I was going to say, as a practicing meteorologist, I'll be happy to address that question in my talk. It's a great question.
So I do think that there has been a disconnect between the meteorology community and the climate science community. And that's contributed to sort of this long-term problem of not having meteorologists engage as fully as they might, and frankly, science teachers as well. I mean, most people get their science from their kids' science teachers and, the weather report to, caricature a little bit, as well as everybody reads Andy Revkin. But, I mean, the rest of the science they get from places other than .Earth. Anyway, I will thank you because I think I'm supposed to go to the airport.
Yes, thank you so much for a terrific talk.